Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Master's Class. We're going to be covering Patterns of Interaction, Chapter 14, Section 1, the formation of Western Europe, and the Church Reform and the Crusades. So let's get right into it. So, to help you out with your notes, make sure you go to page 379 and make sure you access this chart. So use this timeline to note important events in what we call the Age of Faith from the years 900 to the year 1500. So let's set the stage a little bit. We have this period known as the Dark Age, right? The year 500 to 1000 CE. And we've talked about groups like the Vikings, how they sort of raid Western Europe, primarily church monasteries, because we found out monks really aren't that great of warriors. And the church seems to have this habit of storing all their silver and their gold in these monasteries. So as a result of the Vikings ransacking all these monasteries and stealing plunder, all the silver and gold of the church, this leads to the perception that we need to sort of revive the church, right? We have to restructure both spiritually as well as, and we're going to see this, militarily, these places of worship. So this leads us to the Age of Faith. So one of these monasteries, Cluny, in France, in the year 910 CE, this is an important date for you to note, the reformers wanted to sort of restructure the basic formats of the Christian religion. So how are they going to do this? Well, one of the big aspects for the Age of Faith, which is basically just this religious feeling, right, of this era, is that we want to reform some of the practices that the clergy, the members of the church, are practicing, right? We want to take an examination of the men of questionable morals who are attached to this church. So we want to restructure how priests and the clergy marry. So many village priests, they marry, they have families. Well, the church wants to put an end to that. So these marriages are against the rulings of the church, or what we call canon law, right? The laws of the church. Nuns cannot marry, they are brides of Christ, right? So we're having that as a restructure. Bishops, all right, engage in a practice called simony. This is basically where you say, hey man, I can get you a really good spot in at this church. I'll get you in, I got the hookup. So they're kind of selling these positions for money. And this is a way you can buy favor with people down the road. You have the daughter of some noble family. You want her to be stationed somewhere nice. I know a nice nunnery that I can put her up in. You got like a ne'er-do-well kind of son. Well, I can find a good spot for him, and heck, we can even make him a bishop if you pay me right. And then we talked about this, lay investiture, right? So kings that were appointing church bishops. We saw Pope Gregory VII crack down on that with Henry IV. Remember Henry IV at the showdown at Canossa begs for forgiveness. Please don't excommunicate me. I don't want to burn in hell. I want access to heaven. So the church reformers believe that the church alone should appoint bishops, and that's how they're going to go forward. So there's a lot of restructuring, right? In the Age of Faith, the sort of revival of the church. So you have some popes, notably guys like Pope Leo IX, and especially Pope Gregory VII, who sort of reinforce laws against simony, right? We're not going to sell church positions. Priests aren't going to get married. And we're going to have a group of advisors we're going to put in place as we reform in the 1100s and the 1200s, right? We're going to establish the papal curia, right? This is going to be the Pope's closest advisors, and they're going to help develop canon law, which we will rule on in the curia court, all right? So the law of the church in the papal court. So we're going to determine matters of marriage, divorce, inheritance. We're going to step in between the disputes of kings and even nobles. So, diplomats for the Pope travel throughout Europe, right? They're going to deal with these nobles. They're going to deal with the bishops of various lands in Western Europe. They're going to deal with the kings, and they're going to act as kind of middlemen. They're also going to collect the tithe, which we've covered. Remember, the tithe is the 1/10 of your yearly income that's taxed by the church. So every Christian family has to pay this tithe. And the church is going to use that money for things like social services. We're going to care for the sick and for the poor. We're going to operate hospitals throughout medieval Europe. We're going to open up monasteries. Remember, monasteries are primarily the places of learning. But they're going to do other things with that money too. They're going to pour it into the Franks, right? They're going to pour it into the Crusades, but we're going to get into that in a moment. So there are some other new religious orders that spring up as a result of the Age of Faith, right? This sort of revival of the church. So in the early 1200s, we're going to have two notable groups that begin to open up. One is the Dominicans, and the other the Franciscans. And these are not monks, all right? And they're not priests per se. They're similar. We're talking about friars, right? Friars take vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. And unlike the monks, the friars did not live apart from the world in monasteries. So they travel around. They're primarily poor. They preach to the poor throughout European towns and cities. They don't own anything. And they live primarily by begging. They beg for food. They beg for shelter. They beg for money, and this is kind of seen as an act of Christian faith. If you provide this friar with shelter, with food, with clothing, that is you doing your Christian duty. That's you performing a good service. So I mentioned that we have these sort of these new orders that are established from these friars, right? So we have Saint Dominic, Spanish priest. He's going to found the Dominicans, all right, this order of friars. They emphasize the importance of study, and they're scholars. And the same can be said of St. Francis of Assisi, who's an Italian. He founds the Franciscans, and he believes that we must treat all creatures, animals, basically all life forms, as if they were our spiritual brothers and sisters. And you even see women getting in on the action, right? Like St. Benedict's sister, Scholastica. We have another woman, Hildegard of Bingen. She's kind of like a mystic musician, and she is going to find her own Benedictine-like convent in 1147. She is going to have a lot to say about how women are going to operate for Christ, right? So you should live in poverty. You work to help the poor and the sick. But however, unlike the friars, these women, they're not really allowed to travel from place to place as the friars do, as preachers do. You also have in 1212 a woman named Clare, all right? She's a friend of St. Francis of Assisi, and she's going to find her own sort of Franciscan order for women. And then we have, between the years 800 and 1100, an establishment of cathedrals. So these are different churches, right? We talked about monasteries. We talked about the village church. We've seen grand cathedrals like the Hagia Sophia. That's more Romanesque. Now we're moving on to what we call the Gothic style, all right? It's a new style of architecture in the 1100s. It evolves throughout medieval Europe. The term Gothic comes from one of the barbarian Germanic tribes. The Goths are also known as the Visigoths, sometimes rivals of the Franks. And these are really grand cathedrals. You can see from the structure of them how they're supposed to invoke faith. So unlike the heavy, gloomy Romanesque buildings, you can see light streaming through huge stained glass windows. And they're going to be littered with art, with sculptures, with wood carvings. And of course, the stained glass windows are a big aspect of the Gothic cathedrals. And we'll see an image of that momentarily. And all of these elements are meant to inspire the worshiper of the magnificence of God, right? And remember, most European peasants, uneducated, illiterate, so I really can't, and I don't speak Latin as well, so I don't understand a word that this guy is saying. I'm kind of following along with like an illuminated manuscript, and I'm also looking around at the imagery. I'm looking at the stained glass windows as I'm prompted to, and this kind of lets me know, like, okay, I have a general idea of what's going on and how these icons attach themselves to my faith. So I look at the stained glass windows, and I can look at just the structure of the church, and I get a very strong significance of the magnificence of God and my place here on earth. So you look at cathedrals like the Cathedral of Notre Dame. You look at Chartres and Reims and Amiens and Beauvais, and you build these really tall cathedrals. Over 500 Gothic churches. They're going to be built between 1170 and 1270. So this is where some of that tithe money is going to build these cathedrals. And you can see some of the common elements. So the Chartres Cathedral, and you can see the stained glass windows, right? So this is all supposed to give you a very significant idea of the sort of work of God, okay? And just understand that this is not something that you knock out in a month. You know, when you build a cathedral like this, you might be a worker who's tasked to, just haul brick, and you might live and die in one lifetime, and the church wouldn't be done. It's oftentimes that a cathedral like this would take 100 years, maybe even 150 years to complete. But they are very structurally sound. But as I said, you're dealing with individuals like the Magyars, the Vikings in particular, and the Seljuk Turks, right? These sort of Muslim Turks who have been conquering and pushing further and further into Christian lands, the Eastern Christian Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And the question becomes, how much longer does it take for them to get their way into the West? So I talked about this in a prior session. We were covering the Seljuk Turks. It all starts off when these Turks are pushing into the lands, and you have Emperor Alexios Komnenos. He wants to reach out to another group, right? He wants to reach out to the Western Church. Maybe you guys can help. Maybe in Rome you can throw out some money. And also maybe you can help militarize some of those knights y'all have, those Franks. You seem to be dealing with those Vikings, those Magyars, and some other groups as well. Maybe you can send them over here. And this is going to be a grand opportunity for the Western Church and even for some noble princes. So Emperor Alexios Komnenos in 1093, he's the Byzantine Empire. As a result of these Muslim Turks pushing in, he's going to reach out to Robert, the Count of Flanders, and he's also going to reach out to Pope Urban II by sending letters to them. And basically he tells them this: "Come then with all your people and give battle with all your strength, so that all this treasure shall not fall into the hands of the Turks. Therefore act while there is still time, lest the kingdom of the Christians shall vanish from your sight, and what is more important, the holy sepulchre," the tomb where Jesus was buried, "shall vanish. And in your coming you will find your reward in heaven, and if you do not come, God will condemn you." So, like I said, this is a strong cry for help. And this is where we're going to see Pope Urban II sort of hook up with Robert of Flanders, and they're going to begin a journey, a mission known as the Crusades. Stay tuned for part 2.